All right on time. Good evening. We're going to be learning Maseches Eruvin, Daf Ayin Beis, and we're going to be starting about 8 lines from the bottom of Ayin Aleph Amud Beis at the words My Rav Meir Umay Rabbanan. Yesterday, we spoke about a topic that will carry much of the day today, and that is the question of the interface between Shitufei Muvaos and Eruvei Chatzeros. Now, a Shituf Muvaos is that people are then able to access the Mavui from their Chatzer, but an Eruv Chatzeros is from the house to the Chatzer. So do you need both? If you only did one, can the other compensate for you? We briefly spoke about this yesterday, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper because this has its roots in the Tanaim. Let's get started. My Rav Meir Umay Rabbanan. How does Rav Meir and how do the rabbis hold in regards to these various different types of Eruvin, the Shituf Muvos and the Eruvin Chatzeros? The Tanya, the Brisa writes, Me'arvin b'chatzeros bepas. One is allowed to be ma'arev a chatzer, namely to be able to carry from your house into a chatzer, you can use bread. V'im ratzu, that seems to be ideal. V'im ratzu, and if you wanted, im ratzu la'ar beyayin ein ma'arvin. You cannot have a Eruvin Chatzeros with wine. Mishtatfin b'mavui v'yayin. What about shitufei muvos? So says Rav Meir, he says that when it comes to shituf mavui, you can use wine. V'imratzu lishtatef bepas mishtatfin. So the distinction so far within Rav Meir is as follows. In regards to Eruv Chatzeros, you can only use bread. And in regards to shitufei muvos, you can use both bread and wine. Good. 5 lines from the bottom. The Arvin b'chatzeros mishtatfin b'mavui. Why, says Rav Meir? He gives the hashkafa of the halacha. We don't get to always see this. This is beautiful. Rav Meir explains, why is it that we need all of these dinei derabanan? And he explains an idea that we've seen before. The Arvin b'chatzeros mishtatfin b'mavui shelo l'shakeach toras eruv min hatinokos sheyomru avosenu lo irvu. The reason why we have these dinei derabanan and these unique halachos, if you can use bread in eruv chatzeros but not wine, and in shitufei muvos you can use both. The reason we have this is to ensure that our children know that we have a Ruvei Chatzeros, that we have Eruvin, and it's not stam that people can carry. That's all Shitas Rav Meir. The last line of this brisa, 3 lines from the bottom, V'chachamim omrim, o me'arvin, o mishtatfin. You can either for me'arvin, either for an Eruv Chatzeros, or mishtatfin. Very difficult to understand this shita. We don't know exactly what he means. We know he's arguing on Rav Meir. We'll be spending a lot of the time today trying to figure out what exactly this shita holds. And in fact, let's get started with that right now. 3 lines from the bottom. Pligi ba, there's a machlokes in the Amoraim about this Mishnah. Pligi ba Rav Nechumi v'Rabba. So they were arguing about what pshat was in our Mishnah. And here is how they thought that maybe the machlokes went. Chad Amar, the pas in regards to bread, Dekule almalo pligi debechada sagi. Everyone agrees that if you only had bread, that bread would work for both a Eruvei Chatzeros and for a Eruvei Tchumen. That's not true. That bread would only work for Shitufei Muvos and a Eruvei Chatzeros. We're not talking about Eruvei Tchumen at all. Sorry, delete. So thank you very much. I hope someone caught that because it didn't make any sense at all. Yeah, were you? You really was. I was in agreement with you. I thought it was like you and your magma tiles are perfectly. Yes. So this first shita in the Amoraim looks at our Mishnah and says everyone agrees that when we're dealing with bread, that it works for both shitufei muvos and for eruvei chatzeros and dvechad sagi. If you had just the bread in one place, it would work for everything. Kipligi, where do Rav Meir and the Rabbanan argue? That's only biyayin, and if you look in our Mishnah, that's the machlokes. It's only about wine in regards to eruvei chatzeros. However, that's only the first shita. On the top of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, we learn the second shita of the Amoraim that helps us to try and understand our Mishnah. The Chad Amar, here's another approach to our Mishnah. Really, not our Mishnah, but the Brisa of Rav Meir and the Rabbanan. Really, biyayin dekule alma lo pligi devo'inan tarte. Everyone agrees. Rav Meir and the Rabbanan agree that if you have wine, that lo pligi, everyone agrees that it does not work in regards to both Eruv Chatzeros and Shitufei Muvos. They're devo'inan tarte. There we would say you need 2 different types of Eruv, and that for sure would not work. Ki pligi bepas. Where do they argue? They only argue in regards to bread, and that would be the machlokes that we saw in our brisa as to whether or not it works in all cases. So then asks the Gemara, you've just given me 2 approaches, and now I'm going to ask you a question on approach number 2. Meisive, what did it say in our brisa? It said, quote, "V'chachamim omrim o me'arvin o mishtatvin." And how do we understand this line of the Chachamim? My lab, is it not the case that when it says o me'arvin, it's talking about b'chatzer b'pas, talking about a yard with pas, with bread? Oh, and the other part of this line of the Chacham was mishtatvin b'mavui b'yayin. That makes sense because each of these foods are their ideals. It's bread for a chatzer and wine for a mavui. And Rashi, third line, says, "My lab, the kasha laman amar beyayin lo pligi," asking on version number 2, the one that's on the top of this very page. So says the Gemara, no, it's not a problem at all. Amar Rav Gidal Amar Rab Hachi Kamar. Your understanding of the Chachamim's line in the Brisa is not troublesome at all to version number 2 in the Amoraim that said that there is only a machlokas in regards to bread. Hachi Kamar. Here's how we should understand it. O me'arvin b'chatzer b'pas. You can either be ma'ariv b'chatzer with bread, and then umutarim kan v'kan, and then it will allow you to carry both in shituf muvos and in iruvei chatzeros. Or the other part of the chachamim was mishtatvin b'mavui b'pas umutarin kan v'kan. Basically, bread works everywhere. That's basically the way that we would understand the chachamim. So that is how the two versions of how we understand this brisa. The Gemara doesn't necessarily have a conclusion. It seems to be the case that we follow the second version because we just asked a question and answered it. And then the Gemara says how we paskin. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, halacha ki Reb Meir. The halacha is like Reb Meir, that we are concerned, as the Brisa wrote explicitly, that we are concerned about l'shakeach Torah seruvo. The children won't know about Eruv, so we have to make sure that we have these halachos in place. When can you use bread? When can you use wine? All the limitations therein in order to ensure that children will know why it is that we keep the halacha that we do. The Rav Huna Amar, no, it's not that. It's minhag ki Rav Meir. It's not that the halacha is like Rav Meir. It's that the minhag is like Rav Meir. And then the third version is still more different. For Rav Yochanan Amar, nahagu ha'am ki Rav Meir. That people actually behave this way. What's the difference between all three of these? Take a look at the fifth line of Rashi. I don't have a dibur hamaskal here. It's right after the two dots. It says, Hilchasa u'minhag v'nahagu. These three lines, that the halacha is like X, or it's minhag like X, or it's nahagu like X. What does all of this mean? So it says the Gemara, Beperak Basar, the Tainis, we'll see this hopefully when we get there. Mefaresh, here's the pshat. Halacha darshinan b'pirka. Halacha ki Reb Meir. When there is something where we say the halacha is like person X, that's something that we'd give shir on. Rav Meir, everyone, all the Amoraim would say, we paskin like Rav Meir. That's giving a public shir. Minhag is midrash lo darshina. We don't speak about it from the pulpit. However, oruye morinan. However, we do paskin that way. When people come to the Rav and ask a shayla, we do paskin that way. And leyachid haba limlach nahagu. Oruye morinan leyachid haba limlach. A person who comes to ask a shayla. What about nahagu? The people function that way. Oruye nami lo morinan. Even there, we would tell you that that's not what you should do. However, v'i avud lo mechinan behu. You're not doing the ratzon of the chachamim, but we don't push back on you. You have a real marimakom to stand on. So there's the whole gamut of whether or not we paskin like Rav Meir. Categorically, yes, we scream it from the pulpits. We don't scream it from the pulpits, but it's the actual psak. And number 3 is you really should not be doing this. But okay, lo mechinan behu, because you actually have a real sheet in the Tanai. And that brings us to this Mishnah. And this Mishnah will take us to the next Mishnah, and that's where we will be pausing for the night. The shir that I prepared with this for was a little bit longer, and then I ended up starting at a fresh Gemara, so it was no point. We'll just learn the whole Mishnah tomorrow. So we're going to start now. Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, a third of the way down in the Mishnah. Chamisha chaburos. There were 5 groups of people. Sheshavsu b'traklin echad. They were in a large ballroom. What was the mitzias of this ballroom? We're going to spend some time in the Gemara talking about it, but Rashi here, a couple of inches above where we are, gives us a little bit of detail. They were in a large room. It was broken up into 5 spaces. Everyone has their own exit from their space into a chatzer. So these 5 people, if they're all heading into a chatzer, they need to all be ma'ariv with other people who share the chatzer as well. So that's what the case is in our Mishnah. And here says the Mishnah, we have a machlokas, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai omrim, eruv lekol chabura v'chabura. Every one of the 5 in the chabura, they all have to make an eruv in order to join in the chatzer. Beis Hillel omrim, eruv echad lekulan. Oh no, that's not true. Everyone is allowed to use. Everyone can join into only one eruv, and that would be sufficient. Umodin, however, Umodin, they do agree. If in fact people were really living in closed off rooms in a real room or in a real attic, so then then for sure everybody is going to need to have their own Eruvin. So what kind of walls were there separating whatever, there's more than 5 of us here, but what kind of walls were separating us? If the walls went all the way up to the ceiling, Pashat, that everyone's in their own space, that's no different than being in your own house. Then of course you would need an Eruv. So what was the Metzias of the case here? And that from here till the bottom of the page, till the very last word, we will see 4 different shitas of what this space looked like. What were the separations? And here's answer number 1. The Gemara opens, Amar Rav Nachman Machlokas b'Mesifas. We're talking about very, very low walls. Aval b'Mechitza Asara. What if the wall was 10 tefachim tall? So then, Divrei Hakol Eruv l'chol chabura v'chabura. So Rav Nachman was of the opinion. Where do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue? That's when the wall is under 10 tefachim. You're talking under 40 inches from the ground. It's like a curb. So like all that you have separating me from your space in this large trokland is a little bump in the ground. So in that case, machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. But, says Rav Nachman, once it gets to 10 tvachim, everyone agrees, even Beis Hillel would agree that everyone needs their own Eruv. That's version number 1 of Rav Nachman. Version number 2 of Rav Nachman, Ika de Amrei, Amar Rav Nachman, Af b'Mesifas machlokes. There's even a machlokes about the very, very low wall, even the one that's just a tiny bump in the ground. And he said that the Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would argue even on that. Next case, next version. So we've seen 2 explanations of our machlokes in our Mishnah. Here's number 3. Pligi bar Rav Chia Rav Shimon Rabbi. And what are their shitas? Chadam are machlokes b'mechitzos hamagios latikra. According to one shita, these are walls. Though the Rishonim point out they're not real walls. Maybe they're curtains. Maybe they're like, I don't know, like the beads, something kind of separate. It's not a full wall because otherwise it'd be a house, but it does go up to the ceiling, and that's where the machlokes is. Aval, had it been mechitzos she'ein magios l'tikra, had it been that the walls don't go up to the ceiling, divrei hakol eruv echad l'kulam. Everyone would agree that everyone would need their own eruvin. V'chad amar, the last possibility of our Mishnah where the machlokes is. V'chad amar machlokes b'mechitzos she'ein magios l'tikra. The machlokes in our Mishnah between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is only where the walls don't quite reach the ceiling. Aval mechitzos hamagios l'tikra divrei hakol tzrichen eruv l'kol chabura v'chabura. But then, had it been that the walls did in fact reach the ceiling, or the whatever type of sheet you're using, then in fact it would make it its own room. And those are the 4 options of machlokes in our Mishnah. And this brings us to the top of Ayin Beis, Amud Beis. And here asks the Gemara, let's see if we can chisel down our 4 options, because we have a source in the Tanaim that indicates that one of these options is correct. Meisivei, Amar Rav Yehuda Hasavar. This is a great name to have. He was called the logical one. Take a look at Rashi. Hasavar, al shem churfe kari lehachi. Because he was such a sharp mind, he was just really very capable. And when he would ask his questions, you saw him cutting. You know, we have these lines in Shas. Oker Harim is the person with the brains, and the Sinai is, we saw this in Rashi, I don't remember, somewhere in this Masechta. The Sinai is the person who has harchava, just a tremendous amount of knowledge. Those kinds of people, they're different profiles. So in this profile, the Rabbi Yehuda that we're talking about is Rabbi Yehuda Savar, just a brilliant mind. So it says Rabbi Yehuda Savar, what is going on in our Mishnah? Where's the machlokes in our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, the machlokes is here. Lo nechleku Beis Shammai u'Beis Hillel al mechitzos hamagios l'tikra. They are not arguing where the walls reach the ceiling. Shetzrichin eruv l'kol chabura v'chabura. Pashud, everyone agrees. There is no machlokes that if the sheet reaches the ceiling, that everybody needs their own chabura. Alma nechleku al mechitzos she'ein magios l'tikra. When you have I was in someone's house like this. Strangely, it was their own bedroom that did not have a wall that went to the ceiling. It left 1 foot between, it must have been added in later. It doesn't make any sense. So their room just had let's say the ceilings were 8 feet, their bedroom walls were 7 feet. So fine, it was a very strange construction, but that's the construction we're talking about here. The walls are there, but they don't quite reach the ceiling. They held that those walls were sufficient enough that every group is now separate, and therefore everyone had to have their own eruv. No, eruv echad l'kulan, you can still use only one. Those walls are not sufficient to properly separate people. So then the Gemara is going to go through all 4 of the answers we saw to see how this Shita of Rabbi Yehuda Savar plays out. We're 6 lines down on Ayin Beis Amud Beis. Says the Gemara as follows. According to the shita that we saw in the bottom of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, that the machlokes of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is where the walls reach the ceiling, says the Gemara, Tiyuvta. This brisa rejects that because we have Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda says the machlokes is only when the walls don't reach the ceiling. So according to Rav Nachman, who said that is it Rav Nachman? No, it's the other shita. That the machlokes, according to the shita on Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, that the machlokes is when it touches the ceiling. That has to be wrong because this brisa doesn't agree. So the Gemara rejects that one. Ulaman de Amar, and according to the shita we saw on the bottom of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph that says that the b'mechitzos she'ein magios tzirka machlokes, that the machlokes is where the ceiling doesn't quite touch the top of the wall, where the wall doesn't quite reach the ceiling. That's siyata. Now this brisa is a support to that because it's a mamish the same exact thing. So here we have Rabbi Yehuda HaSavar, and we have our shita from the bottom of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph that says the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is where there is a wall, but it doesn't quite reach the ceiling. Perfect. What about the next shita? According to Rav Nachman, where the first version of Rav Nachman, where he said that the machlokes is by a small wall that's less than 10 tvachim, pashut that's not in agreement with Rabbi Yehuda Savar, that's rejected to Yufta. That doesn't work. Ella says the Gemara. Rav Nachman af b'mesifas machlokes. However, according to Rav Nachman, who says that any wall, even a small wall, is part of the machlokes. So it could be that maybe Rabbi Yehuda Savar would agree. It could just be that any wall of any height up to the ceiling would be considered part of the machlokes. Lema tehavet tiyufta. Would we say here that this is a rejection? Says the Gemara, Amar lach Rav Nachman, pligi b'mechitza. Yes, it's true, like we said above by Rabbi Yehuda Savar, that the machlokes is about a mechitza. Who adin b'mesifas? There's also a machlokes there. Ay v'hai dekamiflage b'mechitza. Okay, if you're saying that, why didn't you say mesifas? Why did you tell me that the machlokas was by mechitza? Says the Gemara, lo diacha kochan de Beis Hillel. Because think about what Beis Hillel is saying. Beis Hillel's got a kula. Beis Hillel says these 5 groups are in a trachon. They're in a large space. All of the separations between them are walls that almost go up to the ceiling. And what does Beis Hillel hold? Only one Eruv is required for all of them. They don't all require their own Eruvin. That's a huge kula. So says the Gemara, the fact that Beis Hillel was of the opinion that the walls almost go to the ceiling, and he still says that they only need one Eruv for all 5 chaburas. Says the Gemara, to show us how powerful of a leniency the shita of Beis Hillel really is. Asks the Gemara, well, what about the reverse? If you would have said that Beis Shammai is machmir even on a short wall, that's also a chiddush. So asks the Gemara, I understand that if you're saying that, okay, there's a chiddush by Hillel that he says that the walls almost go to the ceiling, but we still say it's as if you're one unit. So say the same chiddush, but in the opposite direction by Beis Shammai, which is you barely have a little bump on the ground, 6 inches off the ground, and you're telling me that everyone's chayiv to bring their own Eruv. Says the Gemara, why is it that we focused? Why is it that Rabbi Yehuda Savar spoke about mechitzos and not about the case of mesifas? If Rav Nachman's right, that the machlokes is both about the tall wall up to the ceiling, not quite, and about the mesifas, the low wall, why not teach about the mesifas? Says the Gemara, a famous principle in Shas, koach dehetera adif. It's easy to be machmir. It's not easy to be mekel. To get a real kula in a real shaila is a really big deal. You need big shoulders to answer some of these shilas, wild things about, you name it, under every category in halacha. There are always crazy kulas when you know about it. The more knowledgeable a posek, the more lenient they are going to be. So, very good. So that's why the Gemara, the brisa on the top of the page that quotes Rabbi Yehuda Savar, even though, as Rav Nachman explains, really our Mishnah has a double machlokes. It's talking about both walls that are very tall that almost hit the ceiling, and about very short walls. But the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Savar focused on the taller wall was Lodiacha Kochan, to show us the chiddush of Beis Hillel, that they do not each need their own Eruv, and they can have one for all of them, because koach dehetera, because it's more powerful to highlight a leniency than it is to highlight a stringency. 1/3 of the way down, Ayin Beis Amud Beis Amar Rav Nachman. How do we paskin? Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Halacha Rabbi Yehuda Savar. So we say that Ladina, it's an interesting thing because he doesn't paskin halacha. He's just saying where the machlokes is. So he's basically responding to the 4 shitas he's not responding because the timeline doesn't work out. Amoraim are after Tanaim. So the Gemara presented the 4 Amoraim and then says, well, I know I presented them all to you, but there was a flaw. It was kind of like the question that was being asked just for the letdown. So the Gemara says, I have 4 ideas for you, but only one of them is right. because we paskin, quote unquote, we paskin like Rabbi Savar, that really the machlokas in our Mishnah is only talking about walls that are very tall. What would be a great example of this? Cubicles in an office. Let's say under an emergency circumstance, everybody's living in their office, in their cubicle. Those walls are subject to this machlokas of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. And we paskin l'kula that if we would needed an eruv, one eruv for everyone would be sufficient. The cubicles are more than 10. We don't care if they're more than 10 tefachim. They could go almost all the way up to the ceiling. As long as there's some space for air to get over, you're good to go. You're good to go. That would solve the problem. What?
And then belong to the person as well.
What does that mean? They don't what?
Working in the cubicle doesn't own that space.
Oh. Well, that's a good question too. Yeah. I don't know how you run your office. Yeah.
There's always one guy.
There's always one mark. Yeah. So that's what the Gemara says about halfway down, that we paskin that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Yehuda Hasavar, that the case of the machlokas of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about that case of walls that don't quite reach the ceiling. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Masnisa Nami Deka. I can bring you a raya from our Mishnah. How so? Dekatani. What does it say in our Mishnah that we learned on Ayin Beis Amud Aleph? The Mishnah that writes Dekatani umodim bizman shemiktsas and shrim bechadar muve'aliyos shetzrichen erev kol chabura v'chabura. That's a quote from our Mishnah. What does that mean? The Beis Hillel would agree that when people are actually in their own rooms and attics, Beis Hillel capitulates. He turns to Beis Shammai and says, "I agree. Everybody needs their own erus." Says the Gemara, "My chadarm, my haliyos." What were we talking about? If you're saying that people are mamish in their own spaces, sealed off, pasha pshita, everybody knows that you're going to be chayav to each bring your own eru. It's the same thing as being in your own house. No different. So obviously, what must we be talking about? Elalav ke'ein chadarm u'ke'ein aliyos umaynihu. We must not be talking literally about rooms, but things that are similar to rooms. Umaynihu. What does that look like? Says the Gemara, mechitzos hamagios latikra. These are walls that get close to the ceiling. Shema mina. That is in fact what our Mishnah is talking about.
Wait, so if everyone's in a house and you need an eru?
No, not if everyone's in a house. The example given here in the Mishnah was specifically a trochlin. Because if you have 5 people who live in a house and they're all somech on one shulchan, that's the next Mishnah that we're going to learn tomorrow. When we start tomorrow, we're going to, if you look at just at that Mishnah, ha'achen shayu ochlan al shulchan avihem. The next Mishnah talks about that. What if you're somech al shulchano? If all my kids living in my house, they need an eruv to go outside? No, because they're somech al shulchani. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But here we're talking about trochlin, where it's 5 different souls. Everybody lives in their own cubicle, and do you need an eruv? Yes, no. So we paskin the kula like Rabbi Yehuda, like Beis Hillel. But no,
it's a hotel that you need.
But a hotel, it's clear what you need because there everyone's in their own dedicated rooms, walls up to the ceiling. So for sure that everyone will need their own eruv there. But here again, if you look back at the Mishnah in Beis Amud Aleph, the Mishnah says Chamesh Chabrosh Shavsa B'Trochlin Echad. The 5 of them are in some type of place where it's a weird place. It's a ballroom basically. So just a large opening. Okay. Did I miss something?
No, you stay at different hotels than we stay at.
Okay. I must. Says the Gemara halfway down. Tana, the last section for the night. So where exactly is this eruv located? We haven't really discussed that yet. What we've been discussing is the parameters of what the walls look like. Good, but let's be thorough. Where's the eruv? If all 6 of us are staying in this trochlin in each of these cubicles, okay, we paskin the kula. But where's the eruv sitting? Is the eruv with us or is the eruv somewhere else? So that depends on 2 versions of a brisa. And those 2 versions of a brisa are analyzed here. Here's version number 1. Tana, halfway down. Bamed dvarim amurim. Where is the machlokas that we have here between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? And where is it that we're lenient that like Beis Hillel, when the walls don't quite reach the ceiling, where's the eruv in those cases? Says the Gemara, Bamed dvarim amurim. Kshemolichen es eruv an makom acher. That's talking about where the eruv is located elsewhere, not on site. It's not in the trochlin. It's elsewhere. Aval im haya eruvan ba'etzlan. If the eruv was in fact in the trochlin, direi akol eruv echad lekulan. There, Beis Shammai would agree to Beis Hillel. No problem. If the eruv's in the room with all 5 of us in our own cubicles, even Beis Shammai would say no problem because the eruv's in the same room. So then, based on this version, we'll see another version soon. Based on this version, that means that our machlokas in our Mishnah is only when the Eruv is elsewhere, right? And Rav Beis Hillel in our Mishnah was therefore lenient to say that even when the Eruv is elsewhere, still in the cubicles, we only need one Eruv total for this whole group. Good. Kiman Azla. And who does this sound? Who does the following brisa sound like? Kiman Azla Hadatanya, who seems to be the author of the following brisa. What does the brisa say? Follow the language carefully here. Chamisha shegavu es Eruvan, 5 people for whom their Eruvin have been collected. Kshemolichen es Eruva lamakom acher, just like our case, right? Like we said, according to Beis Hillel, the Eruv was elsewhere. So then Eruv echad lekulan, one works for everyone. Kiman, that's mamish Beis Hillel in our Mishnah. Because version 1 of the brisa we just learned was that our Mishnah was talking about where the Eruv was elsewhere. And what did Beis Hillel say? Lekula, one Eruv for everybody. So this brisa says the same thing. The Eruv was elsewhere. Who's that like? That's like Beis Hillel. Perfect match. However, v'ika de amre, we have another version of this brisa that does not paint the same picture. It's the reverse of the first model. The first model said that the Eruv was elsewhere. Let's see what this one says. V'ika de amre, b'med dvarim amurim. Where do we say that the Eruv was in our Mishnah? Kshahaya Eruv ba'etzlan. That's the exact opposite. No. When do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have their machlokes? That's only if the Eruv is in the traklin, in the room where all 6 of us are stationed. However, aval, but if the Eruv was outside of the traklin in another location, there, Beis Hillel would backtrack and hold like Beis Shammai, that everyone needs their own Eruv because the Eruv is off-site. So says the Gemara, if that's true, if that's where our Mishnah is, then the brisa of Kiman Azah Hadatanya, the brisa that we saw earlier, makes no sense. Because Chamisha Shigavu es Eruvan Kshemolichen es Eruvan Lamakom Acher Eruv Echad Lekulan Kiman. Who in the world would hold that way? According to this second version, the only time the Beis Hillel is Mekil is when the Eruv is in the traklin. But who's Mekil when the Eruv is not with you, according to version number 2? Nobody. And that's why the Gemara says, Delo Kechad. That's Pashut, not a Shita in the Tanaim. Because our Mishnah is going to be the source of where does the Eruv have to live? Does it have to live in property or off property? So that's I'll just summarize this piece and then we'll pause for the night. In the first version of this machlokes asked us, in our Mishnah, the 5 cubicles, where's the Eruv? Version 1 said that the Eruv was off-site. And even there, here's the Karesh, even there, Beis Hillel was lenient. The Eruv's not here. We still only need one for all of us. With all the walls that are from floor to almost to ceiling, Beis Hillel is going to be lenient. However, version 2 is the exact opposite, where he said, no, the only machlokes that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel had was where the Eruv was on site. And if that's the case, this Mishnah that we just learned about where the Eruv is off-site, there's no author for that. There's no precedent for that. So one of these 2 versions has to be right. It's not. We don't have a conclusion from the Gemara. We'd have to look in the Rishonim and see in the Shulchan Aruch how it plays out. But that is how the Gemara understands. So Sikum Hadvarim. Let us summarize what we've learned today. In the first Mishnah, we're not going to focus on that right now. Where did we start today? I'm on the wrong page here. Here we go. Okay. So basically, what we've concluded from this Mishnah is that the case of the Chamesh Chaburos, the summary is like this. What case are we dealing with? Where do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue? They argue for walls that are anything other than flat on the ground, up to but not yet touching the ceiling. And they also argue only one of 2 ways. Either they argue only where the Eruv was on site, or only where the Eruv was off site. But we don't know which one from the conclusion of the Gemara. We have to see in the Rishonim how that would conclude. We'll stop right here and we'll pick up at this Mishnah. Tomorrow is Wednesday, so only 1 blot. Okay, good. So tomorrow's only 1 blot, and then we're back to blot and a half land for Thursday night. Have a good night, everybody. Welcome to you.